Good morning, everyone. This is Lisa Dulski-Watkins with the Milbank Memorial Fund Multi-State Collaborative. Welcome to our monthly topical webinar. People are still dialing in, so I'm going to give it just a few moments. Also still expecting our guest speaker, who I don't think has called in yet, so it'll just be a moment. In the meantime, just as a reminder, please remember to mute your phone or your audio on your computer so we don't have competing sound once the presentation gets started. Looking forward to our presentation today with Dr. Craig Jones.
Hello, is Lisa on from Milbank?
Yep, hi, Craig, is that you?
It is, it is. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you just fine, Craig. Thanks for joining us, and we'll get started. Are you on logged in as well, or are you just on the phone?
No, just on the phone.
Okay, great. So you just tell me what slides to move, and I will do that. So I'm going to start with our first slide. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Milbank Memorial Fund Multi-State Collaborative Monthly Topical Webinar. This month I am delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Craig Jones, who joins us today and going to be leading a presentation, and then we'll have a facilitated discussion about data aggregation, feedback, and quality measure alignment, all in support of the Comprehensive Primary Care Plus model, and actually really some broader support of other advanced payment models and primary care transformation. Craig, I'm going to go to the second slide, just as a slide of disclosures. This is a description of all the amazing stuff that Craig has been doing. He's working as a contractor to Deloitte and the Innovation Center at CMS to assist with strategic planning and implementation of data and health information. He works as a contractor at the Office of the Coordinator as well, assisting states in addition to the CPC Plus regions with health information infrastructure, and also works for an organization called Privis Health, a population health company. And Craig and I worked very closely over the last 10 years on the Vermont Blueprint for Health, a primary care, a tremendously, I think, successful and exciting innovation program that we're very proud of in the state of Vermont. Craig comes with a background in pediatrics and allergy and immunology, and formerly on the faculty at the USC and LA County Medical Centers. So Craig, I'm delighted to have you join us today, and I'm going to turn over the talking to you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. I really appreciate the opportunity, and want to thank everybody who's on the phone for joining the conversation. And I just want to say before we start, our real hope here is that we do spur some conversation about how data aggregation and feedback and alignment work can be optimized, particularly from the payer and convener perspective. And so we'll finish up with some questions around that. and bring you some information that we gathered from payers and conveners at the recent Millbank in-person meeting, the multi-state in-person meeting. So our goal is just to keep building from what we've heard at that meeting and actually use the input we're getting from you to help design our data aggregation with CPC Plus. Please feel free to chime in at any time. If we start on slide 3, Lisa, just some quick context. I think everybody that's involved is likely aware of all this. It's just always good to put a little context and perspective on how long the buildup and focus on primary care transformation has been going on. That's emphasized in the slide. It started back with a multi-payer advanced primary care model and has gone through a series of models, including the initial comprehensive primary care program and now leading into comprehensive primary care plus. But one of the real things just to point out is also on this slide, I remember when we started in this journey of primary care transformation, there was always a lot of debate. Should we focus on primary care? Are these models worthwhile? Is this small? Or should we do big things like ACOs and umbrella type budgeting models? And I think over the years since the initial multi-payer advanced primary care, what's really matured, one of the things that's coming together across the country is an understanding of how they fit together. And that was really highlighted by the recent report from the Primary Care Collaborative on how primary care is such an important integral part of ACOs. And so the hope is that this will keep spurring the focus on primary care, and particularly how CPC Plus model is testing such important principles, and those principles that can be successful and adopted into these larger accountable care type and value-based payment model structures. So good to see the evolution in this. If we jump to slide 4, this of course is a summary snapshot of the Comprehensive Primary Care Plus program. Again, I think everybody on the call is familiar with this. That's why you're here. It's always good to just refresh on how big an initiative this really is, and how it spans across so many different geographic regions in the country. And like expected, there's tremendous variation in how these regions are coming together with the model, what is emerging in terms of practices and transformation efforts and strategies across the country. A great opportunity to help continue maturing the primary care foundation, which is so essential. And so we're going to focus on the data aggregation side of that, which also varies substantially across regions and is considered such an important driver of the model. If you go to slide 5, and this is where we really begin to dig in a little bit, this is the picture of the CPC Plus logic model from Comprehensive Primary Care Guide, and it's really a well thought out logic model. I put it in here just to, again, refresh on some of the important aspects. The model is supposed to drive these comprehensive primary care functions, which are so critical and essential, and then one way or the other have been woven into every medical home model since this movement started. And we all pay a lot of attention to these primary care functions and whether they're being carried out and how they're being carried out. And frankly, are the new payment models actually driving real change in these functions? But I also want to focus everybody on the bottom half of the logic model and those essential components that are supposed to drive and contribute to the effectiveness of these primary care functions. Optimal use of health information technology, really a data-driven process that's guiding ongoing improvement and practice operations, and then also, of course, the payment model itself. And in principle, the use of data and the use of feedback, the use of information should be fundamental to driving all of these comprehensive primary care functions. And one of the great questions in this CPC Plus model is the degree to which that actually is going to take place. And that's really the heart of this conversation from a provider and a convener perspective, how can we optimize the use of data aggregation, feedback, and alignment to help drive this model? And we already have some good insights into what some of the priorities are. This is if we go to slide 6. Milbank has been conducting this CPC Plus regional market survey with payers and examining each of the milestones on the CPC Plus payer partner collaboration roadmap. And they've reported on the results twice now, I believe. I'm sorry if I'm mistaken on that, Lisa, but I think there's been 2 reports and good progress in getting an understanding of what evolution is taking place on these milestones. And if we look at the very first one is what are the regional priorities for alignment, I thought one of the interesting results that Milbank has shown is shown on slide 7. And when you ask payers about the regional priorities, again, two results stand out. First off, the largest number of regions responding, payers in regions responding that data sharing to practices is one of the top priorities, and that aligning quality measurement is one of the top priorities. And that's something that seems to be holding. And so right at the base, we have strong interest in using data to drive the model and aligning on quality measurement across payers. So the fundamentals are there. They line up with the CPC Plus logic model, and that really then leads into the question, okay, how do we make this really real? What are the strategies, what are the tactics that are being learned that can make this data aggregation and feedback most effective? And so CMS has entered into this wholeheartedly, and if we go to slide 8, we can begin to talk about that. The use of data to drive this model and transformation is woven into their logic model, and they've participated in trying to have data feedback be an essential ingredient and make it available to all the CPC Plus practices. And this slide summarizes the 2 ways in which CMS is actively participating in data sharing. The first off is CMS's reporting tool. They're using Medicare data, fee-for-service claims data, and providing feedback to practices through their own feedback tool. It started out with reports generated in spreadsheets that were interactive to a degree, and now is moving over to a fully functional business intelligence tool. And every practice in the CPC Plus model has access to this type of feedback. So a really important step. The second way in which CMS is participating is through multi-payer reporting. In a subset of the CPC Plus regions, CMS is working with multi-payer efforts where there's a data aggregator to provide the CMS data, combine it with other payers' data, and provide feedback and information to practices that, again, will help drive practice transformation. And the idea here being that in some way, multi-payer information and feedback is an efficiency that should help practices operate. And that's really one, again, the fundamental question is how to optimize this effort. So this sets up the context for what we're going to talk about in terms of really trying to optimize data aggregation, feedback, and alignment. But let me stop here and see if there's any thoughts or comments or questions to this point in terms of how CMS is participating or any other basis for the discussion.
Thank you, Craig. So anybody have any questions or comments for our presenter before we launch into the next part of the discussion?
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah,
okay. Well, I don't know how my system here. This is Bill Golden. How are you doing, Craig? You know, we have been getting different information about capacity for the second set about, you know, the aggregation and the analytics. And do you have any comments? That seems to be like a moving target in all of our discussions. Do you have any reflections about where we are in terms of capacity to make some of this happen?
Sure. To a degree, I certainly can't speak on behalf of CMS internally and what their decisions around capacity is. What I can speak to, and what actually the good portion of this discussion is about is the way in which CMS is approaching making the decision and the criteria they're using and how they're going about it, that at least I get to interact with, and that really forms the basis for much of the rest of the discussion. Fundamental, Bill, to this is the demonstration for the capabilities within the regions, whether they're ready to accept CMS data, work with it in combination with other payer data, and provide feedback to the practices in their region. And that assessment, that readiness assessment or capabilities assessment, is just an essential ingredient. That's a starting point. And that's really what they're looking for. From the beginning, as best I can tell, CMS has expressed the approach of really just being one of the payers to join what is already active within regions. So they're looking at the maturity of those capabilities, making assessments, and using that information to help guide their decision making. And I'm going to show a bit about that and where things stand now.
Yeah.
Does that get to?
Yeah, well, I mean, I wish it was that simple, but it's been kind of a mixed bag experience in that regard. But okay, I understand.
Sure. Yeah, that's that first part, the actual technical capabilities and the readiness from that perspective is the part I'm most familiar with. And to that end,
Yeah, hi. This is Susan Peretta from Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield, New Jersey. The CPC Plus program is relatively new to me, but so my question is, under the multi-payer reporting, you indicate about a standardized data set. Is there a resource of where I can find what that is? What elements are included in that?
There is, what happens is the regions that have an aggregator, a data aggregator, and produce these standardized data sets are in place. So each region may have, and they do have, different aggregators and different approaches to how they're working with the data. So the real answer to your question is that it varies by region, with each of the aggregators having their approach. And what then CMS tries to do with the across regions, both within regions and across regions, is work on alignment opportunities. So the way in which the different regions aggregate the data and use their methods for attribution and generation and measure results does vary. And then CMS holds to some goals for some common alignment for particular items, such as how expenditures and utilization are reporting, for example. Does that help? Now, so the short answer to your question is each of the regional aggregators would have their own methodologies and standards for approaching aggregation.
Yeah, that helps me. And I guess it's the key is understanding what the common alignments are that CMS is using.
Yeah, and we can let's get to that in the rest of the slides. I think that'll help frame out some of the conversation here. Hey,
thank you.
Lisa, do you mind going to slide 9?
Nope, I'll go right now.
So this is the basis for the assessments that CMS is using in each of the regions. And I just want to highlight the framework for you and show you an example of some of the types of questions that are being asked. So this framework, if you will, is adopted from the Office of the National Coordinator's Health IT Resource Center, and particularly out of a quality measurement implementation guide. And you'll notice 3 major sections to it. The one called foundational elements, then there's some core technical capabilities, and then there's the data use capabilities. And to your question about standardized elements, these are the keys that have to be in play to varying degrees, but have to be in play in the region to actually have successful data aggregation and data use. And so as CMS is looking at each of the regions, they're evaluating their current status and their capabilities relative to these capabilities. We often pay a lot of attention to the technical capabilities and to the data use capabilities, reporting, analytics, things like that. But really, it's often the foundational components that are most important and just have to be in play for successful data sharing and data aggregation. And by the way, this framework would apply to data sharing and data aggregation of almost any form, whether it's claims data or clinical or integration with other state data sources, social data, economic data, for example. These elements have to be in play. So what CMS is doing first and foremost is working with Deloitte to go region by region and evaluate these foundational elements. Are they in place, and to what degree? And does that signal that the region is ready for multi-payer data aggregation? If it does, if the foundational components are in place, then CMS works with Deloitte to go on and do an assessment of the technical capabilities in each of the regions, including all the elements you see in the middle boxes there, such as identity management, data quality, their ability to aggregate the data and standardize it. And this goes to the heart of your question about what a standardized data set looks like. If there is an aggregator in place, then their data transformation or standardization will be the approach that is evaluated in each region. So does that help to address your question on data standardization? It really varies, but it has to be in place.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you.
Now, what's interesting and not surprising is that as you go region by region, these capabilities, both the foundational as well as technical, vary substantially. And this is really what's essential then to go in and kind of do a detailed assessment, understand that, and then, again, CMS use that information in making some decisions around where data can be shared. And if we go ahead and look at these foundational components, first and foremost, they ask the question of whether there is a compelling business case, whether the payers in a region believe there's a compelling business case to share their data and to aggregate data. If there's a compelling business case, have they formed and is there in place an effective governance and decision-making structure? So how are they going to work together? Share the data, what are the rules around that, and what are they allowed to do with it? And if there is a compelling business case and decision-making forum is in place, then are there policies that are either helping or hindering data aggregation and data sharing? Are the legal agreements in place for the actual data sharing, and to what degree? Do the payers have agreements with an aggregator with practices, and so on and so forth? And then next comes, have they come to a financing structure for data aggregation, and is that in place? And are the payers sharing the costs, and are also providers involved in that? And then next, if all those ingredients are in place, what's the support for practices to use the aggregated data? And if you really think about it, these are really the foundation for effective data sharing and form a really important basis for helping CMS to guide their decision making. If we go to the next slide, 10, you can see how the example of how the questions are framed out for these foundational components. So, for example, in assessing the business case in a region, they'll interact with the multi-payer group. There's usually a multi-payer convening, and understand the degree to which the payers believe or embrace the idea or the value of sharing claims data, and have they committed to that, and to what degree. And on the bottom, you can see the answer options that are used to assess each of these foundational components. It may be that there's no plan in place. There may be in a planning phase. They may be in an early implementation phase. They may be operating with data aggregation and feedback at a limited scale, or they may be operating at full scale with most or all of the payers, but less than a year, or they may be operational at scale for more than a year. And what Deloitte is doing with CMS is holding discussions with these multi-payer convenings and evaluating each of these foundational components against those scoring options that you see on the bottom, walking through business case, governance, policy, financing, legal, and end user support. And then again, helping to use that assessment to judge the readiness of a region for data aggregation. So before we take a look at the results, let me stop there and see if there are any questions around how these foundational components are being evaluated and the scoring option. I'll just add in, they're being evaluated in two ways. One is direct conversation with the multi-payer groups and asking these questions as a group. And there is also a survey that is sent out to payers, and the payers are asked the questions around these foundational components. And then that survey response is also tallied and looked at. So two ways of evaluating these foundational components in each region. Let me stop there and see if there's any questions around that, or if this helps clarify some of the questions that people have.
Any questions
around that,
or comments for Craig right now?
All right.
Okay,
well,
Craig, so I guess I'll go to the first one.
Yeah, let's take a look. Let's take a look at the results on slide 11. So here's the 18 regions. They've all been evaluated against these foundational components. You can score up to 5, anywhere from 0 to 5, as you saw on each of those foundational components. And this is the average score across the foundational components for a region, and it gives you a sense of what the distribution looks like. And again, is not surprising, wide variation in terms of the results. So it's a good starting point to help CMS look at this and say which regions seem to be more ready for data aggregation and data sharing. And then back to Dr. Golden's question, there'll be, I'm sure there are other considerations in play that CMS has to take into account. There are a number of them, but this is a starting point to help them judge which regions have these foundational components in place. And then again, for those that appear to be those that are actually conducting multi-payer data aggregation and have higher scores on the foundational components, they then go on to assess each of those technical capabilities I showed you in that framework. And that's a second assessment that's done in those regions that have active data aggregation underway. So again, let me stop here before we take a look at the results, see if there's any questions. Quite a bit of variation, as you can imagine. Okay. So if we go on to the next slide, slide 12, this gives you, we begin to look get a sense, I should say, about how readiness and scores on these foundational components relate to what's actually going on in regions. So they're grouped into, the results of the foundational scoring are grouped into 4 categories, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide. The group 1 regions are the ones where there's a high readiness and CMS is already sharing data. And I'd like to point out that's just grown recently, last quarter, from 3 regions they were sharing data with up to 5. And they're still looking at other opportunities and options for that. But those are the green regions that had they had high scores on their foundational components, on the technical capabilities, and CMS is now actively sharing data with them. And you can see then there's a second group in blue. They have high readiness, but for one reason or the other, CMS is not yet sharing data with them. They may be working through considerations or other issues. And again, to Dr. Golden's question, some of the other considerations that the Innovation Center takes into account in making their decision about where to share data. So there are groups with high readiness where there isn't yet data sharing. And then the next blue group is those with some medium readiness, and this is just broken down, as you saw by that distribution chart, and they're not quite ready for data aggregation yet, but they may be working on it, and we've seen some regions accelerate quite rapidly. And then group 4 is regions that have low interest and readiness for data aggregation. It's just not a particular interest for them. And you'll notice the red stars on 3 regions. Those are single-payer regions where there's only one payer besides Medicare, and so that's often another a contributor on the decision-making. Now, take a look at the rest of the chart, though. It gives you an idea about their capability to aggregate data, and it also on the x-axis, and then it gives you on the y-axis information about what they're actually doing with it. And there's some correlation here between their readiness and what's actually going on in a region. So there's no regions where there's no use of data. At a minimum, all regions have data shared by the individual payers to a degree, and there may be a minimal learning process or a minimal structured learning process that's in place. In some regions, the individual payer reports are being used, but being used as part of a more structured learning process. And then in some regions, there's aggregated or shared data and reports that are used as part of a learning process. So there's data aggregation and multi-payer reports, and they're part of the structured learning process. And there's a continuum there. It's not easy to completely categorize the regions, but this gives you an idea of the spectrum. And it does have a pretty good correlation with the readiness for data sharing. Overall, the regions that have the highest capabilities and foundational components tend to be at the top in terms of having a structured learning process to support their feedback and reporting. And as you would imagine, it also correlates with whether they're aggregating claims data or aggregating claims and clinical data together and using it as feedback. So this gives you kind of a sense of where the 18 regions fall, both in terms of their readiness, the types of data they're using, and whether they have a highly structured learning process in place. Let me stop and see if there's any questions on that. I will say, there's some things that may not be intuitive right away, such as you'll see there's a number of regions that use individual payer reports as part of a structured learning process, but there's several of them that also have aggregated claims data, and you actually do find this type of situation in regions. There may be an all-payer claims database, but it's not used to give multi-payer reports for a number of reasons. Could be policy reasons. It's just not used, and so it's the individual payer reports that are actually used, even though they do have the technical capability for aggregated claims data. I just want to point out there is that kind of variation, and that's where you begin to dig into what the limitations are. Why aren't the aggregated claims being used? And it again helps inform the readiness assessments for CMS. Well, if there's no questions on that, let's jump to the next slide, slide 13. And this is kind of the take-home, if you will, on the assessments and how they're being used. The bottom of the table shows you whether CMS is sharing data and when data sharing began. And the y-axis shows you the average foundation rating. And so you can get a sense of data sharing activities that are in play and where the regions fall relative to their readiness. So sorry guys, some staff is getting restless here. So you can see the 5 regions with high readiness are in green, and we've already started data sharing. And you can see that that we have some regions that also have high readiness, and they're under work with CMS to consider the opportunity. And then there's the other regions that still to be determined whether they'll get get to a stage where they are ready for data sharing. So let me stop there and see again if there's any questions.
Craig, it sounds
Any
like
questions on that?
Dog has some questions.
Yeah. Any questions for anyone?
I think it's interesting. Well, Craig, I'll just shoot a question out. Maybe just looking at the sorry, back at the I just moved the slides on by mistake. The single payer region. So obviously these are regions where there's a single payer participating in the CPC Plus in addition to CMS. And you see there's some pretty different behavior in just the three regions that are identified that way. Is there an explanation for that, or something that you observed there?
Yeah, there is. It really goes to the heart of, I think I guess probably the best discriminator is how data is being used. So again, you may have, if you go back to the slide 12, you'll see in the region mark 16, they may be using the reports, but not as part of such a highly structured learning process. We're in region mark 17, and by the way, the numbers here are not correlating across slides, so no giveaway as to which region is which. They actually have a highly structured approach to using multi-payer data, even though they're not doing data aggregation. So there's a structured learning process, but they've got some good alignment around the reports and the way the data is being used. And so they have a very structured learning process, but are not yet ready or interested in aggregating multi-payer claims data. Does that help, Lisa?
It's not hit, but I think it's...
Yes, it does. I'll thank you, Craig. And if I could just remind people who are on the line, we're getting a little bit of background noise. Please mute yourself if you have to have a separate conversation. Thank you.
Now, this all gives you a sense, and I know it's a lot of information, but it gives you a sense of how the regions vary. And I think that's probably the take-home that's most important. They vary in terms of readiness. They vary in terms of interest. They vary in terms of the structured learning processes. And this is the challenge of such a complex and large national experiment, to try and use data to drive transformation despite, or in the context of really, this extremely varied landscape. And it's really, it's an exciting challenge. And so one of the goals is to optimize and do the work we can to optimize the way in data aggregation, feedback, and alignment helps the model. And that's really where we go into the next layer here in the discussion on slide 14. Through the data aggregation work and the assessments with the regions, there's a number of opportunities for alignment that have emerged through surveys and discussion, a large list actually, but this kind of summarizes some of the top line ones, maybe the ones that emerge most frequently. And I'd really like everybody I appreciate the opportunity, everybody to take a look at these and see if they make sense, if they look familiar, and if there's any inputs you have on how to improve this list, if there's other opportunities for alignment, and if there are really good strategies that you've seen in the region around alignment. So attribution and practice assignment with multi-payer data is one of the big ones. It varies, the methodologies vary by data aggregators, and it turns out to be really important because that forms the basis. Attribution and practice assignment really forms the basis for reporting multi-payer measurement back to practices. And one of the goals, one of the objectives has been to, as much as possible, see how we can align those methods across regions that are doing data aggregation. Then what populations are used for performance measurement and payment, and what level of alignment is there between CMS, the other payers in the region, and what types of opportunities are there to align that so that practices actually have well-structured incentives and have enough of a critical mass in terms of what they're working on that they're able to really drive transformation. Third is the specifications for measures that apply across payers. They're going to vary. That's natural, and there's a lot of input that happens with that in the multi-payer convenings in aggregator regions. And one of the big challenges for multi-payer convening is to get payers to agree on the specifications and what their priorities are for measurement and what specifications can be used for that measurement. Another opportunity for alignment is providing actionable information to practices. It's one thing to just report large numbers of measure results. It's very different to package it in a way that it's actionable and that practices seem to be able to respond to it and use it. So a lot of learnings from the different aggregators and the different strategies in regions about what really works and what practices like to see. Another opportunity for alignment is around benchmarks and understanding comparative performance in regions. There's a lot, even the displays and how they're used can vary and be very important in, again, presenting actionable information. And we want to take the best practices and offer them across regions. Another key is the support for practice use. I highlighted that as a foundational component. Is there sufficient support in terms of coaches or facilitators or outreach to practices that actually helps them with the use of the data and understand how to use it? And can we share those best practices across regions and assist with that? And then lastly, how well aligned are the reports themselves, again, in terms of populations, measures, formats, and drill downs? And are there particular ways in which that's presented that really help with the uptake and the use of the information and practices? So there's some opportunities for alignment that we found emerging across regions. And thought I'd stop here and see if there's any input from people that are participating today.
This is Lisa. Are there any other items that come to mind that aren't on this very comprehensive list?
What and/or ones that stand out as most important to you is payers and conveners? Maybe that's helpful too. Which ones do you feel are top level priorities?
Hey, Craig, this is Dick Shonk. Can you hear me?
Hi, Dick. Sure.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'm just thinking about our own experience in going through this. I think sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming to look at everything that has to be in place in order to do data aggregation. Has there been any thought given to what parts of these capabilities need to be kept in a region, and what parts of them could be, exported or contracted out?
I think that's a great question. I think Dick, that's really come from the regions themselves. I think there are different, as you know, there's different approaches across the regions to these types of things in which they're either contracted or kept in-house, how it's broken out and how the work is done. And we've seen it done effectively, a couple of different ways. I mean, there's so far only 5 aggregator regions, but we've seen it done in a number of configurations. And so I can't point to one configuration, maybe whether it's all housed within one entity or distributed in some way, contracted out that has clearly emerged. I don't know that we have enough experience to say that. I will say that in situations where everybody is tightly aligned, whether it's because they're housed together or through their work arrangements, they're tightly aligned on an end-to-end approach, meaning literally from the work aggregating the data all the way through the practice support, that end-to-end alignment seems essential. But let me stop and ask you what your thought is around that.
He's ready.
Well, in our journey, I think that one of the things that certainly, I don't know if it has to be, but it's certainly things that are practice facing or end user facing. There's a lot of relationship and trust that goes on, and I think that those should be kept within a market, and where people have those relationships and the like. Some of the input, I guess I would bucket it in three different areas. There's an area that kind of crosses over, and there's an area that that I think have to happen. So I would say anything that's practice facing or end user facing should be definitely kept within the market. I think on the other end, things that can be, the aggregation process, the way claims get processed and so forth, certainly is a back office work that can be contracted out. I think in that middle range, there's that, it would probably be a hybrid of, and so for example, selecting measures and getting buy-in to what those measures are, or doing some standardization, I think could be a middle. I'm just thinking that it might be helpful for the regions to kind of think of these actions in that way, so that they don't feel like they have to bite off the whole thing, that they could it could get there gradually, but recognizing what are the important things to keep within the market. That makes sense?
It does. Very helpful. Great way to frame it out. Let's see if there's any others on the phone that have any response to that or thoughts around that. And I think it's a very helpful way to package it and look at it. So thank you.
Okay.
I was wondering, is that someone trying to jump in, Lisa? Can you tell, or?
I think that's just some background noise.
Okay. All right.
Any other
Well,
questions or comments or responses to questions? No? Okay. We want to move on to the next slide.
I have a question on a related matter. Can I ask that, Lisa? It's Melanie Cavalier.
Sure.
So, as we roll out the MBPCP here in Maryland, we would like to put some state supports in for certain things. One of them is the PFAC, and we've been working on a guidance document for this. But what I'm interested in is some feedback on, I know originally, or what we heard in the past was like each practice had to have their own separate PFAC. Have you guys heard any movement on this? Do you think it would be possible if we either wanted to get together some central resources and maybe get like a few smaller practices together to do one, or if we could help them set them up by offering them some support to, recruit their patients for them, set up the first couple meetings for them, and then let them take them over. Does anybody have thoughts on how we can help facilitate this with smaller practices?
Well, I think there's a couple levels there. Is it the actual work with the data that you're talking about to help support smaller practices, or is it more that the feedback is to a group of practices versus each individual practice? I'm sorry, I couldn't quite get the
So I think the question is, does the council have to be specific to just one practice, or could it be a couple practices together that did it? Because I know, I feel like earlier in CPC Plus, they were like, no, even if it's one provider, they have to have their own patient family engagement council, whereas now I feel like they're being a bit more, as long as you have a council, it's okay. Do people have thoughts or ideas on that?
Well, in CPC Plus itself, so far, where there is data aggregation, there are examples of reporting back to by individual providers, you know, NPI, if you will, or TIN, and also examples of reporting back at a practice level. And so we've seen both. I will say, you know, in the end, this is a practice transformation model. And so it really, you can imagine, it's very helpful to be able to report back at a number of levels. Reporting, for at least for CPC Plus, reporting back at a practice level does allow a practice to understand how their practice is performing in aggregate. And then reporting back at a provider level helps practices understand the variation within their practice. And you can obviously see advantages with both. I don't know about for CPC Plus, but I think Lisa and I both could speak to the experience that when you do have regional collaboratives, if you will, or learning collaboratives, being able to work practices to a place where they're willing to share their data with each other and work collaboratively on best practices, that data use culture and the evolution of that is a really valuable signal that things are changing. And we did have the opportunity to observe that in the Blueprint model in Vermont, where practices did evolve to where they did work in groups and did share data with each other in some circumstances. And that's a very powerful signal. So I guess my thinking, what your question's going to is really the trajectory of where things are in terms of the data use culture within the region. And are there really, is there the trust, as Dr. Shank pointed out, and the shared interests that they're willing to share data like that in groups? If they are, that's a very powerful signal about the data use culture. But let me stop and see what others have to say about that. And does that get to the heart of your question? I'm not sure if that addresses it or not.
It does. It definitely addresses part of it. I guess I was specifically wondering about in the patient family engagement environment, if people were consolidating that data or those councils. But we also, in Maryland, one of our large Care First providers does these panels for doctors. I don't think any of the CPC Plus regions are allowed to do that, and we're not currently doing it under the MVPCP. But that gets to what a little bit of what I was asking with that as well. I mean, is anybody considering doing this, or have any practices kind of done this on a informal level? So
Melanie, maybe we should take this question offline, because I think there may be others who are either on the phone or maybe not participating today that may have more insight into that. So that's a good question to put out to the community. I think we can help you with that.
Oh, okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, and so I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'd love to see if we could get at least people thinking about what's on the remaining couple slides here. So at the recent Millbank Collaborative meeting, the in-person meeting, we had the chance in the breakout sessions to gather information on the value case for CPC Plus payers and conveners around data aggregation and alignment work. And the next slide, starting with 15, summarizes some of that. And we've highlighted some of the points here and put in some supportive narrative with it, but I'd love to get feedback and see if these are the right things. First of all, there seemed to be strong agreement that it was important that providers have a single point of reporting with information on their whole population. There seems to be a consensus around that that's an important strategy to help practices and reduce their burden. And I think there seems to be a sense that that's going to be of value to the practices. Next, there was an interesting point about data aggregation and helping practices with combined feedback improves provider relations. Just the fact that payers are working to assist practices in that way seem to have its own inherent value. Aggregation of the data can, particularly where it's claims and claims plus clinical, can really help support reporting of HEDIS measures. That's another value case that we heard. If we go on to slide 16, there was also a strong consensus that by aggregating data and putting out that type of information, that the comparative performance was a very strong motivator. So practices can see how they're doing compared to others across their whole population and by payer, and that comparative performance seemed to be very important. The value of the comparative performance information also depends on alignment. So our methods and specifications being applied so you actually can compare where appropriate across practices and across payers. And then lastly, unmasking top performers and sharing best practices was another way the value case was expressed. So just for these two slides right now, let me just stop and see if those make sense, or are there any thoughts about additional ones that we may want to include. And there are 3 more on the next slide, but I'm going to just stop on those and see if there's any thoughts. So do those sound like the right things? Yeah, go ahead.
This is Dick Schonk again, and and maybe it's on the next slide, but the experience that we had is that the value for an all-payer source of data is proof of concept. So the idea that this methodology works as a alternative payment model, and it's what we found out rather dramatically was that not all populations respond the same way. So in the Medicare fee-for-service or Medicaid, much less likely to show improvement as they demonstrated with mathematic evaluation, but rather dramatic improvement that we saw in an all-payer environment in Medicare Advantage and in commercial. So in order for this process or for this methodology to continue, there needs to be how well is it working? So I would just say proof of concept needs to be one of the things that we would want to build into our all-payer value.
Hey, thank you, Dick. That's very helpful. Appreciate it. No, we didn't discriminate that on these lists, so that's very helpful. Thank you. And if you look at 17, there are 3 more examples that you can see. Don't quite get to Dr. Schonk's point. Payers express they do like to see how their beneficiary population compares. This wasn't a big driver, but it was one of them. The interesting thing is, to the point is, payers and communities, at least in person, were not really clear how to define success for data aggregation itself. Really what determines whether that's important and valuable or not. They didn't really have a way of measuring that, if you will. But they felt it was valuable and were willing to learn how to measure the value of data aggregation as the project went along. They were committed to trying it where they're doing it, didn't quite know how to measure the value of it, but were willing to learn that as they went along. And so that was one of the take-homes too. We didn't have a clear way of measuring the effectiveness of data aggregation, if you will. But Dick, to your point, proof of concept may be one of those, those things that emerges. Any other thoughts on this? Well, if we go to slide 18, these were some of the topics we wanted to leave on the table as important considerations, and you can see them there. Are these the compelling reasons for participating, and appreciate the addition? one question about it keeps coming up is, should providers participate in the governance process along with payers? And should providers participate in the financing? Is that important to make data aggregation and feedback most successful? How important is it to have an official convener? That we've seen emerge in regions as possibly an important element. And what is needed to support practice use of aggregated data? Which strategies are more effective? And are there strategies payers can use to help promote the use of aggregated data? I particularly love some input, if we have time, on that one. What can payers do themselves to help promote the use of that aggregated data? Is there something that can be done with the incentive structure, for example, or the reimbursement models? So let me stop there with, I guess, no time to go. And if we can't have time for discussion on this, we'd love any feedback you can give to Millbank on these ideas that would help advance the data aggregation program. So thank you for the opportunity, but let me stop there, turn it back over to Lisa.
Thank you, Craig, for a wonderful presentation, and I think really very thought-provoking set of questions to consider on this last slide. So I would really prevail upon everyone on the phone to take a look at these. Send us your ideas. Obviously, you can email anytime, and Craig and I are in conversation a great deal, and we can start to work on some of this together, or rather continue the work together. Craig, I don't know if you've gotten approval for sharing of these slides, but if you could let me know. There's been a few requests already if it's possible to have these distributed. I understand there's a process for you, so just let us know if that's a possibility. And if people have other questions and come up with other ideas, please, as I said, we'd love to hear about it. And look forward to our next webinar a month from now. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being on the line today. Yes.
You're welcome.
Maybe if you could copy these 5 questions and put them in an email, we could give Craig some feedback on them.
Absolutely. I'll do that as soon as we're off the line today. Just send it out to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
And once again, thanks to everyone for participating and for taking the time out of your busy days to continue working on this learning collaborative with us. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.